It definitely took a lot of effort, but my kids are much older now. And so I can sort of see the results of our nesting and how it helped them. And, I feel very good about the decision, but I won't say it was a breeze at all. There's so many gradations of it. I was pretty extreme, right? Where had a home, leaving, my ex was coming in, etc. But I think there's a lot of different ways of doing it. I mean, I would even suggest that having a meal together is a type of nesting, anything that just doesn't constantly separate the kids and have them, only with one parent. And obviously the circumstances are different for everybody, but I try to do with parents is just give them my ideas. Like there are other ways that we can go about this. It doesn't have to be always a traditional way.
Welcome back to another episode of Unlock Your Child's Full Potential podcast, where we're all about creating lasting connections with our children. I'm your host, Billy, and today I'm thrilled to introduce our special guest, Kathleen Brigham, a truly remarkable woman I had the pleasure to speak with. Among many other things, Kathleen is a certified divorce mediator who specializes in creating an environment of resolution and peace for families going through divorce. Kathleen and her husband are also the authors of the book The Nesting Experiment: 2 Divorces, 7 Kids, and 6 Years of Uncomfortable Cohabitation. In their compassionate guide, they share insights on surviving and thriving during divorce, with a particular focus on the concept of nesting. Nesting, or also called bird nesting, is where children remain in a stable home environment while parents transition in and out. It's a beneficial arrangement post-separation that minimizes disruption for the children and helps them adjust to their new normal. Today, Kathleen will shed light on why incorporating some level of nesting after separation can be really beneficial. We'll explore different versions of this arrangement and discuss practical tactics for creating boundaries and structure during this challenging time. I have to add, even if you're happily married, there are valuable lessons to be learned from Kathleen's expertise. After all, effective co-parenting and communication skills are beneficial for any family dynamic. So whether you're navigating divorce, supporting a friend, or simply seeking to strengthen your parenting toolkit, this promises to be a light, insightful conversation. And don't forget to share the episode with a friend who might need to hear it. Opting for the nesting arrangement is not all this episode is about. It's about how to help our kids find their new normal after separation, because they are the ones truly affected by it. Let's get right into the good stuff. Tell us about your unique solution for navigating the choppy waters of post-separation parenting.
Well, when I was going through separation and then into divorce, my children were pretty young. So at that time, I was trying to figure out how to navigate all of this. And one of the biggest challenges was this idea of custody and where the children went, right? And I had friends and I'd seen them sort of have their kids pack their bags and have a very structured, maybe a week at dad's and a week at mom's, or however the court systems decided. And I felt very strongly that that was not the healthiest course of action for my children. So I spoke to my soon-to-be ex, and came up with this idea of nesting, which now is becoming more of a term and it's really out there. And a lot of people call it bird nesting, but this was 14 years ago. So this was really, really unknown then. But the basic premise was, how could I keep my children in a stable environment and not let them be the ones packing and moving and changing their schedule and everything? So the idea is that the children stay in a home and the exes come and go. I can get into all the details of it. It can take many different shapes and forms, but the basic premise is that children stay put.
Wow, that's amazing. And could be very hard if the partners don't have very warm feelings to each other.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll say right off the bat, this is not for everybody. And my husband, I'm remarried, and I wrote a book about it. And there's even a test in the book, sort of like, are you a candidate for nesting? So I'm not here to preach and say it's great and it's for everybody, because it's not. It all depends on your individual circumstances. But what I am saying is that if we can pause and just think about the children and kind of put aside, which takes a lot of work, put aside sort of your feelings and your emotions around the divorce and just focus on what works for the children, this is such an amazing tool. Just as an example, think of a child who goes to a school, right? And walks to school every day. So maybe Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they walk to school because mom lives nearby. Thursday, Friday, dad's farther away. So they have to remember to pack their bag and their homework and their favorite stuffed animal or whatever it might be and go to dad's. And that is asking a lot of a child, depending on their age, right? And so we're asking them to do this unbelievable, shuffle of scheduling when in fact, hold on a second, we're the adults. Why aren't we the ones doing it?
That's a good point. Haven't thought about it this way. We're
Mhm.
asking of the children so much. And is it important to make these arrangements right after the separation, or we can take some time to cool off and then decide on this in and out of a family home arrangement?
Such a good question because it can be so heated in the beginning and, maybe that's not the time to do it. So it can be something that's implemented later. In a practical sense, it's usually done earlier on just because you're trying to figure out who's living where, who gets the house, where are we going to be. So although it can be done later, it's usually done in the process of making a parenting plan, right when you're in the early stages of separation and you're trying to figure out who's going to stay in the house. Are we going to sell the house? If we keep the house, who stays? Where does the other parent live? So in all those logistics, it's usually introduced. But to your point, it's a time where it can be, really emotional and really heated. And there are ways to mitigate that. As an example, my ex-husband would come in the house on Wednesday. It's not like I stood there and held the door open and said, come on in. I sort of arranged for him to come in. I usually left about 15 minutes before he came.
Oh, I love that. So it's not too much contact between the spouses. And where do you go if, for example, the father comes for the weekend and you're the one living in the family home? What are you doing during that time?
Such a good question, too. So early days, I was like on a sofa or friend's guest room or something like that. I didn't have like my own separate place because I was really in the home most of the time. But it was a whole combination of things. Later on, when I started dating my now husband, I would obviously be at his place, but it was a whole mix of things. And I will say this outright, it is not easy. If you have all the money in the world and you can, I don't know, rent another apartment, that's great. But most people can't do that, right? So you are kind of a little bit of a vagabond trying to find your way of where you're going to be. There are all kinds. I do a lot of advising on this, and I'm always amazed about how people do things. But there are some people who have the home and share the second space. So that is their coming and going place. I don't know.
That's a bit too much, don't you think?
That to me was like, no, I can't share two spaces. I just can't do that. So it's, to answer your question, I went to friends most of the time. Yeah.
And how did the kids take it? Was it an easy transition for them?
Yeah. In some ways it was so easy that we laugh now that they didn't even really understand what was going on. They were like, of course, this is our house. Of course, dad's coming over. There was a time where my son's friend knocked on the door and their dad, my ex-husband, answered the door. And the boy was like, wait, I'm so confused. What's your dad doing here? And my son was like, my dad's here. It's Wednesday. What's the big deal? So my kids took it very easily. And if you speak to my husband, his children, my 4 stepchildren, also were very easy with it. I think they didn't know any different. They look back at it now. And in fact, we had a few of the kids participate in the book. And as sort of young adults, it's so beautiful to see what they've written about now upon reflecting and saying, wow, I didn't realize how much my parents were doing for us at the time.
How long did that arrangement last?
In different iterations, for me, 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Probably the record holder for the longest amount of nesting. But I want to just, if I can, give you some sort of different phases of the nesting. So early days, there was one apartment and their dad would come in on Wednesdays and weekends. So that was very much a shared space and I would leave. But later on, there would be sort of a home, and he had a smaller apartment, and it wasn't as much coming in for the whole weekend. He might come over, for dinner or after a sports event, something like that. So I wouldn't say that I did this straight for 10 years, but I did some version of it. And I would argue still do some version of it. Sometimes we even have them for a birthday dinner or have a Thanksgiving with them. So I think there are different versions of nesting without everybody, freaking out and thinking, oh my God, I have to share this space forever. It's just more the idea of the ebb and flow of having two parents around.
Yeah, and just maintaining a sense of family unit for the
Mhm.
sake of the kids. Maybe if it's not a shared space, are there some other ways to keep that sense, like a family dinner or some other arrangement?
Yeah, one of the things I talk to a lot of people about is a shared dinner, right? Like a Sunday dinner is a great example, or a Sunday lunch, and having both parents there for that meal. And that, I think, sends a really wonderful message to your kids. The other thing that worked really well for me, and I had 3 young kids, so it was pretty chaotic. There are a lot of activities. We can get very caught up in the structure of custody. This is my day, this is your day kind of thing. But in all honesty, I needed some help. I mean, it was hard to get to soccer practice and, pick up another from school. So if their dad, who was often willing, I'll pick him up, even though it's not my night, and bring him home. That was a really nice arrangement as well.
I love that. It requires a very effective communication on your part.
It does. And I think, for me, what worked well is I moved right into kind of texting and emailing more than speaking. One thing we tried to do is, if we did speak on the phone, to really stick to the kids, because it can very easily get into a conversation about other things. But that's where I think having technology is a really wonderful tool, because you and your ex can make sort of an agreement, like, that's just text. So I used to, when their dad was coming in, I hate the word ex, so I always try to say their dad, but when he came into the home and I would leave a little bit early, I would often send a text saying, just so you know, this is homework, or ballet class didn't go well, or the fish died, or whatever the updates might be, so that he could sort of enter or know what was going on. And I think I got a fair amount of criticism, like, oh, you're making it so easy. But again, I just was like, I'm not making it easy for him. I'm making it easy for my kids,
Yeah, and that's what's important. What about talking to your kids about their dad? You're not talking to him too much, but are you talking to them about him?
Looking back on it, and obviously over the years having different conversations with my kids, and as they mature and age, they have different questions and things like that. I really try to, and still try to, keep it to what's the information that's important for you to know as a child. Like the idea around dad and mom not staying married is really about their relationship, but it's not necessarily about father daughter or father son relationship. So I tried very hard, and I can't say I did it perfectly, but to be really respectful of their father around them, not to throw him under the bus or make a side comment, or, of course he's late, or no wonder he has, no idea what you're doing tonight, that kind of thing. It's really easy to do, and it's really tempting to do, but it's not helpful at all.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Power dynamics can emerge when there's a disparity in time spent with the children. Mostly is the mother, right? So how can co-parents address these power imbalances?
It's a really interesting dynamic, because I always think, okay, what would it be different if we were still one unit, a family unit, right? So I had worked on and off, but I had taken time off to be with my young children. So already I was the sort of primary parent. I was already there most of the time. So in divorce, I was there more of the time, but I think that would have been an imbalance no matter what. So I think this is something that happens in all families, whether or not, you're divorced or not. I think where the divorce adds another layer is that obviously the person's not physically there. So it's something where I did feel like having a conversation before he came in or a text was part of that balance, like, let me catch you up a little bit. But it's never going to be balanced. I realize it's never going to be perfect. And in fact, it's not really my job to always make sure that it's balanced, because it's how both of you participate in this new dynamic, in this new family. So I can't be constantly, filling you in and filling you in. I mean, it takes maybe more effort on that ex's part, but it's up to them then to maybe put in some more effort.
I agree. And as I think about it, it's the same for me here. I'm with the kids most of the time, so it's there either way. What about if we have some potential conflicts or differences in parenting styles that are more evident right now?
This is where a parenting plan is really important. And you can't document everything and say you need to feed them a healthy meal every time you're with them. But I do think the parenting plan, the more detailed you can make it, the better. Basically, you put in as much specificity as you can so that later on you're not going back to the table to renegotiate, right? So it might be things like, how do you align about education? Where are you on funding college? What do you think about summers and who would fund it? You might assume, as an example, of course, they're going to go take these classes in the summer. Well, what if the other, parent doesn't want to do that? Or they say, well, go ahead, but I'm not going to pay for it. These are things you want to outline ahead of time, because you might say to yourself, we get along very well. This is amicable. We both want the best for the children. But I'm guaranteeing you there are going to be rifts somewhere down the line. How do you want them to be educated around religion? All of these different ideas are really important to outline in a parenting agreement. On the other hand, there are things you're going to have to let go of. Like I said, you can't guarantee that they're not going to go and eat fast food, right? I worked with one family who really struggled because even though the parenting plan agreed that this child should be, it was a young child, should be in bed by 9, one parent was not adhering to that at all. So then what do you do? It's in the agreement that the parent's still not going to do it. So there's certain things that you just have to be able to let go of.
Choose your battles.
Choose your battles. And then don't say, when the child's yawning the next morning and you're with her, well, no wonder you're so tired, your dad keeps you up so late. It's not helpful.
I can hear myself saying that.
It's really tempting, though. It's so tempting.
Can you tell us more about the biggest hurdles parents face in staying close with their kids after a breakup? We're now talking about the parent-child relationship. Do you have any advice on what to pay attention to?
I think sometimes we fall into sort of two categories. There's sort of the one who's kind of holding down the fort and doing the daily sort of upkeep and work, and maybe that's getting them to school or getting them to meals. And then there's a parent who might have, it's a little bit of an imbalance. There are 50-50, and those are wonderful, but it's very rare to have a completely 50-50 arrangement. And so sometimes that time, because it's so precious and you don't get the same amount of time as you might have if we're still married, that time becomes what I would call fun time. We accuse my husband of sort of being a Disney dad, like really just having a lot of fun, but not doing some other things. So I think just spending whatever time it is and not thinking that it has to be always fun and always entertaining. Kids really just want to connect. And if you are the parent who gets less time and you're really worried about that, just keep reminding yourself that it really is quality over quantity. Having 10 minutes of a really wonderful cuddle or a great conversation or reading a book together. Those are the things that kids really take in and remember and feel. It's not that you went out to dinner or you got to do something fun. So I think that's one way of staying connected, is just realizing that it's the time that you have together and what you do with it that's important. I think it's where technology can be really wonderful as far as sending a text or something like that to your child and saying good morning or good night. Those can be really nice ways to connect too.
Do you think that because we want this quality time, we are sometimes tempted to not set boundaries, forget about this part, and this could backfire?
Yeah, because think about it. Okay, I'm just so happy to have this time with my child. I don't care about bedtime. We're just going to stay up and finish this movie or, continue talking or whatever we might do. I think overall kids really, really want structure. So it can feel a little wobbly to them, like, wait, I do get to stay up, or what does that mean? So even though they might in the moment think that's really great, I think long term kids really do well with structure. So I think that's where it can backfire. Like you never want to feel imbalanced as a child. You never want to feel like, oh, I have this power over my parent. I can just tell them I want to stay up later. I can tell them that I want to have more ice cream, or, in the moment it feels really good. But long term, that's not a position they want to be in.
In your experience, what are some beliefs or assumptions that parents may have about post-separation parenting that aren't necessarily true? Some of the fears we might have that are not true.
Yeah, I think one is our child's going to choose one or the other. And that's just not anything they ever want to do. And the one who either has less time with the child or in a nesting situation isn't the nester, is the one coming and going. Of course, the fear is there. They're going to be influenced by the parent they spend more time with. They're going to talk badly of me. We're not going to stay connected. All those fears, I think, are really valid. I think the biggest concern is, how am I going to stay connected to my child? And so much of divorce is just fraught with so much stress and, tension between the parents that sometimes overrides the focus on what's the relationship with the child. So anything that might just soften that a little bit. I was talking to a parent the other day and she said, well, I'm not going to open the door. I'm just going to stand inside, and I send my child out to get in her dad's car. And I thought, you can't just stand outside with her and wave. We have to be careful. We're separating from our spouse. We're not separating from our children.
Yeah, that's so true. As someone with experience as a step parent, you understand the complexities of blended families. So can you describe what a healthy family dynamic looks like in these situations?
Well, I can tell you, since we just came back from all of us on vacation, which is very rare. So I have 4 stepchildren and 3 children. So there are 9 of us, which is pretty rare that we all get away together like that. I think for me, I have to continually remind myself that my stepchildren have a mother. They don't need a mother. They might come to me maybe for advice, maybe not, but that's not the role that I'm playing. And that is probably the most challenging for me, because I'm obviously a mother to my 3 children, but my stepchildren don't necessarily need that from me. So I think any tension that's ever been there has been when I may be stepping into that role, and I have to remind myself, oh no, that's not my job, right? That's not my job to give advice or even my opinion unless it's asked. So I think it is probably one of the more difficult roles to play, because you're there, but you're not really there. You're like sort of stepping around this boundary.
Did you live under one roof?
We never fully blended the 7 kids. And we were very mindful and choosing not to do that, mostly for sort of the questions that you're asking. How would that work to have 7 children under one roof? If my husband and I have very different parenting styles, which we do, how do we do that? And so we chose not to do that fully. I do have clients and friends, to your point, that are in the house with them. And then I think even now, there have to be some house rules when the kids come in here. If I feel strongly about something, I get to state it. So I think setting up the house and the rules and that kind of agreement is sort of one way. I guess what I meant by I'm not their mother is that anything that happens as far as how we connect and get along is much more sort of like an aunt relationship instead of a mother relationship.
I like that. I imagine that could be confusing for your kids. They're all brothers and sisters, and they have a different set of rules. That could be confusing.
Very confusing. And I talk to my kids a lot about it. Like, these are our values, right? This is who we are as people and our values. And my values as a parent. And it's very tricky to navigate. Now, they're all older, so they're all making their own way in the world. But I imagine and clients that I work with younger families, it's fraught with so much tension, because you're in a house that has these rules and this structure, then they go to another house with different rules and structure, or they're in your house and they say to you, my mom doesn't make me do that. Why are you making me do that? All of those things. And there's no one answer. All I can say from my experience, the more communication, the better. So to explain to my kids, I realized that I didn't ask the same of your stepbrother as I did of you. But the reason for that is that this is our dynamic, and just talking it through has been really, really useful. But it's very time consuming, I have to say.
And the more kids, the more time consuming.
And it's been changed too, right? With ages, right? So the structure that you might have had when they were younger, then it has to loosen when they're older. So it's not whatever we started, 12 years ago isn't what we have now.
When a new partner comes into the picture, like you've been nesting, you've been having a good relationship with the dad, but now a new person comes in. I can't imagine how that person feels. In your situation is another nesting parent, but if it's a completely different person.
Yeah, it's so different. And then, your kids are like, wait, we're good. We like the way this is working. The dad comes over and you're here with us, Mom. We don't need anybody else coming in here, So then you've got to discuss all those different feelings that everybody's having and how are they connecting each individual with now their stepfather and their father. It's like a spider web of just like all these different connections. And you just have to kind of navigate each one as you go along. So there's some days where it's very easy and there's just such a really nice ebb and flow. And then we'll bump up against something and there just has to be like a sit down conversation.
Where does self-care come into the picture? We're thinking about the kids first, their well-being, but we should care for ourselves as well.
Yeah, I've gotten better at that. I was not very good at that in the beginning. Again, my kids were very young, so I was so hyper-focused on just them and are they going to be okay? And then going back to work full time while they were young, in the midst of a divorce, like all these things happen, which then you feel guilty about that. And then, so you just layer all these tough things on top of each other. We all talk about it all the time. Like we have to take care of ourselves. You have to make sure that you're good and you're healthy. But I will say in getting better at it, I know that I'm sort of I think a helpful way for me to think about it was I want to model for my children a really healthy and happy adult. If I thought about it like, oh, I need alone time or, oh, I need to go exercise, I would sort of put that in the realm of like, oh, I can do that later. That doesn't feel good to me. But if I did it more like, what am I modeling? What am I showing my daughter? That I am actually going to take a break, right? That I am going to go for a run, that she might have to wait until I help her with her homework because I'm going to go and do this. But that, at least for me, was a constant conversation that I need to have with myself. It wasn't like a switch that flipped really easily. I continue to have this conversation with myself, like, nope, this is really important to do.
Yeah, and it's a good way to put it. I'm doing it for the kids. I'm modeling the right behavior. So I love that paradigm shift. Okay, tell us about the book, The Nesting Experiment.
Well, we wrote it because there weren't many books. When we looked around, we thought, well, there's nobody talking about this or helping other people. So it's written by my husband, Chris, and myself. So you'll hear very different voices in it. His perspective of being sort of the ex-spouse that was coming into the home, and then my perspective of having my ex come into the home. So there's sort of those two visions, those two vantage points that you can hear, which I think is really helpful. And then we tried to make it very, very practical. So it's not a big, long book. It's almost like a manual. Are you a candidate for nesting? If so, what should be in a parenting plan? When do you break up nesting? And then we also sprinkled in our stories. So you can kind of read about how we got to this point differently, because Chris came about it on his own and I came about it on my own. And so you sort of get that story, our story, but then we really put in, I wanted really practical and useful advice, something that people could bring to their bedside for a couple of nights, get through it and feel like, okay, I have sort of a game plan here. And it's called the Nesting Experiment. So, which is what it was. It was really an experiment.
But a successful one.
But a successful one, for sure, for sure.
Looking back, you can say it really worked.
I can say I'm so proud of the job that we did and the way that we approached it. I really, every day, I'm so grateful about that. But I also want to always caution and say, I'm not the martyr and I'm not the perfect one who did, like, there's so many different ways to do it. If people are listening to this, I want them to think it's all or nothing, to think if I don't share the home with my husband, then I'm not nesting. I just want people to know that there's just ways to soften that can be so helpful to your children.
I love that. Would you tell people where they can further connect with you?
Sure. So you can find me at brighamadvising.com. That's my website. And through that, there's a free consult and my email and phone number and all that kind of stuff. And the book you can get there as well. You can find me on Instagram at the Kathleen Brigham. And then the book is on Amazon, The Nesting Experiment.
Thank you, Kathleen. This was such a great conversation. I learned so much from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Billy, for having me. I'm really happy that we could sort of introduce this concept to a kind of a different audience. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in and letting me be a part of your day. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest episodes. And if you found today's conversation on nesting after divorce to be interesting and valuable, please share it with a friend who might benefit from hearing it. Your support means the world.